thanks to all of our sponsors, starting off with Safari Montage, Tricia and Tim. So Tricia, go ahead and I'm going to stop sharing. You can take the control.
All right, I'll do it.
Okay. I'll let you know when I see it so you know I see it. And I see you and I see Tim on video.
Awesome. I'm hoping I'm clicking the right screen. Let's see.
Yep.
I think I got it.
Yay. Go, Tricia. Okay, good. I'm going to go on mute and off video.
Awesome. And I think Tim's going to get us kicked off.
Well, Tricia, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then I'll introduce yourself, and then we can get going. So,
all right, super. I'm Tricia Kennedy. I, as Leilani already mentioned, Executive Director of Instructional Development and Support in Gwinnett County Schools. That's a big, long title. The main reason that I'm here with you today is a part of my duties in this role is overseeing our digital conversion initiative, which we call EClass in the district. Gwinnett is a suburb just outside of Atlanta, a large suburb, largest in the state, actually 13th largest district in the country with about 180,000 students. And I've been here 35 years. I started teaching when I was 12, as I'm sure you could have assumed.
Hi, and I'm Tim Beekman, President and co-founder of Safari Montage. I'd like to add a little bit to Tricia. Tricia is a visionary that started digital learning a long time before most districts did. And she's been a leadership on the IMS global standardization group and has developed a lot of the standards and integration as well. And she understands successful implementation of digital instruction and really had things in place. I would say not perfectly, because no one had perfect before COVID, but really their district took off out of sight, out of the right of the start, and understands the relationship to curriculum and the growing need for standardization as well. Next slide. You know, just a little bit I'm going to cover a little bit about Safari before you guys get to the good stuff. And, you know, we started Safari a long time ago, 87. Some of you weren't born yet. But really with the concept of a digital delivery platform. And Safari stands for Students and Faculty Actively Retrieving Information. So there's a method behind the madness. And I think some keys for us was the introduction of IMS Global and standards into digital. We were the first ones to do that in the country and start to facilitate that. And I think another great piece that happened to us in the last few years is we are very large partners with Google and Microsoft. We really add to the Microsoft side of Teams for curriculum delivery, and we're a big partner with Google. Matter of fact, their biggest district in the country, Chicago Public Schools, and us are doing a large Google project as well. A couple other things that we've done is we've introduced a cloud model where before we had an on-prem. We have both now because we have districts that are requiring 16 gigs of data delivered all day long. And you can imagine 16 gigs of streams for most districts would shut them down. So we have to build a hybrid approach to solve that. Next slide. We really have a variety of projects. We have what's called a learning object repository. And if you're not up to speed on that, it's called a LOR. And we really do that outside of the LMS. We don't care what LMS we're using. We don't care what we integrate to. In lots of districts, we integrate with 4 or 5 different LMSs. But the object is in the learning object repository that your content's protected, facilitated, and will work in any environment. It can be aligned to standards. It can create different formats of the play, how to play it, how to see it, how to view it, and it will work with any device. We also have that same model in the cloud. And we have a lesson presenter that's designed for Google and designed for Teams that allows us to create a complete course lesson structure inside of those environments. That's very hot product for us as well. We also do video streaming and video and IPTV. We have a lot of districts, I'm sure all of you are aware, that are recording Teams, recording Google Meets, recording Zoom, and we do all that. We can set a couple classroom cameras up if you want to get a broader scope for hybrid learning. We document it. We let you add metadata to it and facilitate it. Next slide. You know, idea here is very simplistic in what we're trying to accomplish. It's very complicated on the back end, but this is it. And I'm going to talk about this slide because I think you all get it, is that the idea of equity means that I have the ability to grab any resource or create any source, whether that's designed for my district, designed for a broader scope. It's important. Simplification. I don't want 40 places to go to every place and every item. In our model, every content provider, over 300 at this point, integrate their content into our system. And if you're familiar with the new standards alignment of CASE and what's going on with CASE, with state standards and real-time alignment, which is going to save districts a lot of times, and obviously analytics. Analytics, because of what has happened, has really moved the bar. Next slide. So this is just some of the example of the content we integrate. So within the Safari system, one federated search for all this, one ability to create playlists for this item, one ability for students, parents, teachers to facilitate and request this data, one click to add your data to the LMS, and very easy to do this, not complicated. We take this content, we vet it, we add it to standards for your state, or your local, even your local standards, like a Gwinnett, and we make it so that it all is transparent across your delivery platform. Next. The other thing that's interesting is creation during this time has skyrocketed. Obviously, video conference for all of us has been tremendously growth, but classroom observation, school news has really taken off shockingly, which principals are doing messaging from home, sending it out to students and parents. Just a very big model that created content, created items in our lore has really increased. Next slide. So this is a little bit about Gwinnett. We're going to talk about, Tricia's going to talk about the lore and the D2L integration, and how this really provided an enterprise solution. And I think the surprising thing about Gwinnett is the day they went to home learning and homebound instruction, they were basically set. She'd probably disagree with that to some bit, but the idea that they could do it in the first day and have the level of student participation, I think is going to surprise all of you. And I think it was all about their pre-planning, their integration, their strategy. Next slide. And just to show you what the impact was, even in school year 2019, they had over 2.9 million or 2.8 million of plays of resources, which is a huge number. And during the last year, that's over 4 million, and the school year hasn't closed. So the idea of that many resources, think about it, that have to be curated, facilitated, used within their lesson and their EClass structure, managed, make sure it gets delivered, make sure you got data on it, is dynamic. It's incredible, and their growth continues. Next slide. The other interesting point that I think is they used to create some content, right? But look at what has happened in the last year. The idea of the staff and the team are creating many more documents, tying them to standards, creating them in their learning object repository, and managing them. And this is interesting because this is your district's intellectual property when you create this. How you share it, how you facilitate it, how you drive it is all about what the lore is about. Is I'm creating it, I can decide to share it, I can have it vetted. A great example is we're doing the whole state of South Carolina. And in South Carolina, content can be shared at the state level to all the districts, can come up from the districts to the state level to be reviewed, and it's all vetted. It's all can be tied to standards. It all can be shared. Think of the power of your teachers and your staff being able to share things in the sense that the search is clean, that you don't have to worry about losing it, that you can add strong metadata, that you can have a strong search, that you can add standards. Next slide. So I'm going to let you take over from here, Tricia. Thanks.
Well, let me actually flip back a couple of slides. Let me just say this slide that Tim shared of Gwinnett data and this slide that Tim shared, I'm sure this is probably true for many of you as well. Those look like graphs of my stress and work level over the last couple of years too, not just our uploads and our plays in Safari, because it's definitely been quite the year and a half, hasn't it? Gwinnett, as Tim generously stated, Gwinnett has really met with relative success last spring and this year. And I say relative because, as he said, we know nothing's been optimal. But we kept school going from day one, and we kept learning going the entire time, and really at a very high rate of fidelity and a high rate of student success, especially compared to what it could have been. And like Tim said, I really think that's been about, it's been a story of our preparation, what came in the years prior to the pandemic that's made the difference for us. And so that's what I want to share with you a little bit, is that story. So what we started with, we began our digital conversion initiative in 2012. But we had instructional frameworks and practices in place in the district long before that, like the graphic that you see here, which is of our Quality Plus teaching strategies. These are evidence-based instructional practices that we've been expecting to happen in our classroom really since 2006. And one thing to note here is that you can see that the technology is indicated here as being woven into all the instructional practices and not separate. And that's been a long-standing part of our instructional framework and our focus on how we have used technology in the district. And it indicates that from our Quality Plus teaching strategies graphic here. We also have frameworks in place for all grades and all content areas for instructional practices and instructional cycle. This is one example. This is our 6-12 English Language Arts cycle and framework. And teachers really understand, because of years of work on this, what an effective instructional cycle looks like and what it includes. This is an example, or this is our 6-12 math cycle, balanced numeracy framework. Again, a real clear articulation and understanding of the components of effective instruction. And even when we began our digital conversion initiative in 2012, which Tim had already mentioned, we called it EClass because you can't be in K-12 education and not use acronyms, right? But it stands for Digital Content Learning Assessment and Support System. So when we began that EClass work back in 2012, the first thing we did was outline what we expected to be happening in every classroom and how digital tools should support those instructional frameworks that were already in place. And this is one of the communication and professional development tools that we used to explain that and to support our teachers as we move down that pathway. And so only when we had those instructional expectations in place did we begin to build that infrastructure, what the ecosystem that Tim has referenced. And we did use a best in breed model for procurement. In some cases, we actually did some in-house development as well. You see here, this is our employee portal. So you see some of those systems that are part of that best in breed. You see them labeled here. And that employee portal was one of the first things that we committed to. We also have a student portal that we stood up during our initiative. And for both students and staff, we were really committed to a one-stop shop for easy use for our users to be able to navigate. So we established those expectations with our vendor partners around interoperability. Tim mentioned Gwinnett's involvement in IMS Global, and we have been involved since the beginning of our initiative, really committed to that because it's been so very important to us to be able to stand up these one-stop shops. And so we have, you can see here from this student page, we've moved towards more and more digital curated content. You can see their access here. This is one grade level access to digital text and other resources that they get to off of their My EClass portal. So we use that one-stop shop then to provide ongoing just-in-time support to our teachers around those instructional practices that I mentioned as well, QPTs, our instructional frameworks, EClass as an instructional model. This is an example of a playlist of our resources for teachers for QPTs that was developed by our curriculum departments. And this is delivered through our LOR in Safari to all of our teachers, so they have access to just-in-time resources supporting their work with those effective instructional practices that we have implemented and that we expect in all of our classrooms. And we use that ecosystem, with Safari being a really key piece there, in order to deliver those kinds of just-in-time resources for them. And the teachers also have a lot of support in building out and delivering their own instructions, resources for instruction. This is a sample of one of our kindergarten teachers. So yes, our kindergartners are in our LMS and are using it regularly during digital learning and concurrent learning. And you see how she's built out the different pieces there. And the support that's been given to her has been around how to build those pieces, how to take those instructional frameworks and make them come alive in your LMS for your students. And we have other supporting resources in the ecosystem that we've been very dependent on, like our Google Suite. We've recently moved to Office 365 as well. And this year, you see the picture there. For obvious reasons, we went district-wide with Zoom as well this year. So a lot of different resources coming into play in this ecosystem. So those instructional expectations and that ecosystem, that one-stop shop to support the instructional expectations, that was in place before the pandemic hit. And so before the pandemic, we had already actually even had some practice, because we had the ecosystem in place and the teacher learning in place. We had 3 fully digital days over the previous 2 years when we'd had to close school due to weather. One of our colleagues on the chat had mentioned that they were in a snowstorm today. Well, in Atlanta, as you've seen on the news, if you get even close to an inch, it shuts down the system. It shuts down the city and the system. So we had used our ecosystem and our teacher learning and training in the last previous years to have 3 fully digital days. Now, at the time, we thought those were very high stakes days, but as it happened, they turned out to just be practice days. But they really did help us to be able to turn on a dime last spring, when this very week, on the 13th of March, we went to fully digital. So the main point I wanted to make here is that we had instructional expectations in place. We had our digital resources that were selected and implemented to support those expectations. Nothing was random. And when we moved to all digital, we held on to that foundation to help teachers make that shift. So here's an example of how we managed that pivot. I'd shown you the Quality Plus Teaching Strategies resources that we had in Safari. Well, what we did here is we moved to a QPTs gone digital, trying to give teachers concrete examples of how those strategies could be used in a fully digital or in a concurrent environment. And we expanded that too, you can see here in the slide, based on the needs of the moment. For instance, we added in some SEL components to the resources and to the staff development and training that we were doing for our teachers as we moved into this year. This is the new playlist now with all of those gone digital resources in Safari that our teachers have access to this year, as we've been pushing those out on a weekly basis to teachers. Same for our instructional frameworks. Here's a sample of our K-5 literary framework with guidance on how to take each of the components in that framework that was already in existence and move it into a synchronous or an asynchronous digital environment. And you might be able to see here too that they focused on a select few digital tools. You can probably see links to Seesaw, Flipgrid, Nearpod. That was intentional, looking at what would be the very best digital tools to help us in each of these existing components of our instructional framework as we moved into digital environments. Same focus, again, another example here with K-5 numeracy. Again, you see a few select tools and functionalities within our LMS, which we call EClass, which is D2L's Brightspace. So these pivots became the focus for our staff development. And we use the same evidence-based strategies, but then we talked about and shared with our teachers and gave them models on here's how to deliver those strategies in a digital environment. And we provided those just-in-time supports also and are continuing to provide them around our digital tools. So this is an example of a resource that our teachers had over the summer of 2020, self-paced, as well as we offered some live synchronous support sessions on these topics to help them brush up on their digital skills within our ecosystem. So that's the story of Gwinnett and where we've been. And again, it hasn't been optimal, but we have been able to continue doing the work that we felt like we always need to do in the classroom. But I know that not everybody has the luxury of the time that we had of those years in preparing and putting together our ecosystem and training our teachers. So I would have to say, if there was maybe some takeaways for those who didn't have that luxury and don't have that luxury of time, these would be the things I would encourage. I would say what's worked for us is that we've stuck to our instructional philosophy and our framework, and we've kept that the central focus. And then we've built on that. We've built and procured resources to match that instructional framework and philosophy, and holding that very firm. There's a lot of free resources out there for teachers right now, and some of them are fabulous, and it's so great of our vendors to be offering that in this time of need. But not every free resource out there is a best fit for your instructional practices that you want to be implementing in your classrooms. And that's why we've zeroed in on those that we knew were good fits. And then the focus for our teacher support has been on how to adjust instruction using that same philosophy and framework and those teacher moves, but adjusting it to a digital or a blended environment with lots of resources, lots of modeling, a lot of lesson plans that were developed by our curriculum departments to show teachers how to do that, and a lot of virtual live sessions with teachers as well has been how we've been able to sustain during this very difficult time. We do have both in-person and digital students, and we have most of the year had that. And many of our classes are in that concurrent model where teachers are teaching both digital and in-person students. So that's our story, and I'll stop there and send it back to Tim.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna just skip because of time. We'll get about 7 minutes. I want to make sure I stay on time. But what are smart objects? And I think as you build your digital curriculum, especially in these times, this is our definition of a smart object: shared, managed, adaptive, rigorous, and tagged. And if you don't have all that, as you build your digital library of resources, it will become unmanageable. And I think Tricia could tell you that more than anyone, that you build these resources. If you don't take all these pieces in place, it's a problem. Next slide. So the other thing that obviously is happened is now we want predictive type responses for objects. We want to understand what they're doing. Are they effective? And that's just not about real-time data. It's about the value prop of the object itself associated to learning, which if we had a longer time, I'd talk about. But if you look at what IEEE is doing with AI standards for education and some of the other organizations, this is really starting to take off. Next slide. This is something it came from common sense, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. You guys, if you want copies of this PowerPoint, it's great. We'll give it to you. But it really gives you an idea of equity and who has what and how this impact. This has obviously changed, but it's not changed a lot, and it's starting to change over the next year and almost has to. Next slide. And this is something from the Learning Council that we've talked about for a long time, is teachers spend way too much time vetting resources and not having a good way to be able to get to them and not know if they're good or bad. And how do we change that? And I think a learning object repository does a great job of changing that model. Next slide. I'm not going to cover this because of time, because I want to really get into some neat stuff. Let's keep going. Next slide. And standards. Let's talk about standards. As you guys know, in the last 2 years, we all familiar with the lovely PDF of a standard, but now we're getting into models like case standards, where you can get standards in real time, and you can pre-align objects with AI type data or your district's data to those standards as they're produced. This is going to dynamically shift the value of the resources in association to the learning and timing. Instead of waiting to take your PDF, get it part of your lesson and facilitate it, this is moving the bar. Next slide. I'm going to skip this one because I'm going to skip this one too. So let's talk about analytics. And there's a couple of things that we really found strong and have had a major attack on because of the COVID, and that is caliber analytics and access to real time versus access to non-real time. Next slide. And so a lot of this was about these problems. How do I get teachers, students, timely data? And I mean timely in real time, because if you're teaching class at home and you've got kids at home or you're at school, we have seen a dynamic increase in the desire for a teacher to know where their students are in real time. Are they engaged or are they not engaged? How do I need to adjust instruction about what they're watching and what they're learning? This is just taken off on our side because everybody wants this data, not tomorrow. They want to know what's going on in real time. Next slide. So this is a great example. You know, what are my students doing? When are they doing it? How are they doing it? Are they engaged? Are they not engaged? Big question. And if I can see this on my dashboard while I'm at home teaching my kids, or I can see it at school for my kids in school or out of school, I know where they are. I know what they're doing. Next slide. So, you know, this is just an extension of that. Let's go to the next slide. I'm moving fast here. You know, and now I can see what resources they're using, how they're using it. Did they understand it? You know, what are they accessing right now? Are they on the assignment I've asked them to do in the time I've asked them to do it? I can see it. I can see if they did it earlier, if they did it later. Next slide. You know, and I can see how they did in their resource. Did they play all the resources that are associated with their learning? Did they play partial? This is a great example of are my students really engaged? Next one. You know, and how do I shift instruction? You know, I see these kids aren't liking this. They're not getting this. What else can I provide them? What objects are associated? Next slide. So what's ahead? And I'm just going to cover this and end it. But I think it's really interesting to see what's going on the private sector with badging, with digital credentials, VR, and validation of learning. And I think because of COVID, this is going to really start to impact badging, not in a sense of traditional badging where you get a badge, it's cool, I passed this course, but the idea of a learning records store, or the idea that I have in that badge what I really accomplished, the association of that data and the outcome. That is really like places at Walmart, like places at sales.com, Salesforce. They're using that kind of data to really look at badging and where students and where their learners are. And I think we're going to see that in this comprehensive learning record. I think is going to become a huge issue as we stay digital. It's not just going to be about testing what's in their learning record, which then provides that lifelong learning ecosystem instead of your district, and empowers learning validation. I think the new standards like the IEEE virtual reality standard, which takes a lot of human factors involved, is going to have a major impact. So I think we've got this road that you're all on, and I think we're forcing some of the changes, but I also think we're going to force some changes that are going to be dynamic shift from what they were a year ago. I think corporate America has adapted these changes and are adapting them more and more. And I think we're going to start to see those analytics, those student data, the student record, they're all going to become a bigger digital piece of the pie for the future of our students. I'm going to close with that. If there's any questions, or for us, let us know, and we'll be more than glad to discuss them. Thank you.
Okay, so hi everyone. This is Leilani, your host, back on line. I want to make sure if you have a question, please ask it. This was kind of deep, What's really great about Gwinnett and what Tim shared is they're sharing what's happening at the front line of the more sophisticated districts who have at least a few staff to address this. Smaller schools and districts are wowed by it. They're like, wow, this is amazing sophistication. So it's sort of something that you have to think about in terms of where you're going to evolve to. What Tim and Tricia just shared is how complex this is going to get. So you're needing to think with, how do I lead from the digital seat, like Tricia and Tim are talking about? And Tim is a great resource to talk about that whole architecture of how you get it done. He knows a ton about the integrations that have to happen. There's a lot that goes into this. So thank you guys. I don't see any questions popping up. People are probably wowed. This is like, a lot from what you shared. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen back, and I'm waiting for anybody to ask any questions. I'll give you guys a count of 5 and see if you have any questions. And if not, I'm going to move on. This is what teachers do. They go quiet. They're like, ask your question. Come on, people. Okay. So I want to ask one of my own from both of you. And that is sort of what are you seeing the small and medium-sized districts do in this direction so far?
Tricia, do you want me to start? I personally think that no matter what you're doing, if you start to look at the standards that are being produced, they're not an uplift, they're an integration. And if you look at that, no matter what you're doing, and start to engage in doing those integrations across your platforms, you'll become more efficient and have more time. I think the other thing is as obviously as Tricia talked about, that long-term digital plan, but I think that's a key right now, because if I look at our districts, and we're over in 11,000 plus, if I look at the success, it's not if it's big or small. It's what could they do with what they have, and how did they integrate it successfully so they can add to. Yeah. So and I think, the other thing that's important with your big or small is what happens after they leave, after they graduate. That model's changing dynamically right now, and it's something you have to think about. That's my input.
Totally agree. Tricia.
Yeah, the thing I would add to that, really on the front lines, what we're feeling right now, and we, big or small, had to navigate the pandemic and had to figure out how to do school in a very different environment. And we've done things differently as a result. And big or small, what I'm hearing from my colleagues in other districts is we're not going to go back to just what we had before. In Gwinnett, we're looking at how can we maintain some of those options for students, even after we have the majority of our students in school. It was a struggle for many students, but for some students, it was really a great change for them. Some students really have thrived in this, in a more digital environment. And so we're looking at what does that look like going forward as early as next fall, being able to offer more options and choices. And we're very dependent on having those just right resources in order to be able to do that. The digital content that we need, a system for learning, a way for them to connect with teachers, a way for us to manage what might be a smaller group, but we think is going to continue to be a group of students that are going to want this level of flexibility in some form or fashion going forward. And I think every district, so no matter where you are in how you responded to the pandemic, as we start pulling out, and we're hopeful that we'll be able to, we're having to look at what does that look like, and how do we shift, and how do we hold on to the things that were good that came out of this. So having some of those main, knowing what your main focus is, back to what I talked about before, I think is critical for every district, regardless of size.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I love this because, when we really pull back the covers on this, this is actually an equity issue. Your ability to execute in a flexible way is equitable. It creates more equity by itself. A structural shift is an equity shift. And so I love this whole conversation. So thank you so much, my friend Tricia. Hopefully I'm going to see you later this year. Actually,
I know, in person. That would be great.
I know, it'd be awesome. Okay, good. And thank you so much, Tim.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, cool.